I'm very excited to be here today and share some of my research. 45 minutes only scratches the surface, but through this talk, I can at least show you part of what I will become a forthcoming book publication. So. In 1927, W.G. Collingwood began his article, Christian Vikings, by stating, most writers, ancient and modern, represent all Vikings as enemies of Christianity. While academia has in some ways come a long way from this portrayal, the known evidence of the complex relationship between Viking Age settlers and the church has not yet been explored to its full extent. Through my doctoral thesis, I sought to investigate how the members of the early medieval clergy and laity each sought to establish their power and status within the changing multicultural landscape in which new ideas and practices were being shared and blended together. Alignment with a particular group could easily facilitate survival and even movement up the socio-political hierarchy and/or economic prosperity. Furnished burials at or near ecclesiastical sites physically embody this relationship, as they were the product of negotiations between the clergy and the laity to gain and display power, wealth, and status. For general background, the Viking Age is the period associated with the travel, raiding, trading, and settlement of individuals from the area of modern-day Scandinavia or those of Scandinavian descent or association to and around areas outside of Scandinavia, from Iceland to Iran. The period has been typically described as being from 793 CE, the attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of northeast England, to 1066 CE, the Battle of Hastings, which saw the beginning of the Norman invasion of England. However, these dates are merely arbitrary, with increasing archaeological evidence suggesting earlier contacts and Scandinavian or Scandinavian-descended rulership of areas such as Ireland, the Isle of Man, and Iceland occurring until much later. During the Viking Age, a diaspora occurred in which not only people journeyed to different places, but also ideas, beliefs, practices, artistic styles, and material objects were transferred. Areas of both temporary and permanent settled occurred in places such as the Atlantic Archipelago. The Atlantic Archipelago consists of Britain, Ireland, the Isle of Man, and the numerous surrounding islands all the way up from the Faroe Islands to the Channel Islands. Several regions here contain known Viking Age settlements, and within these areas, different people, such as the newly settled laity and the pre-existing clergy, would have encountered each other in a variety of circumstances. The discussion of Christianity during the Viking Age is not a new topic, with numerous scholars writing on conversion and Christianization, or on how a particular key figure like Canute, the late 10th to early 11th century king of England, Denmark, and Norway, or Bishop Donatus of Dublin, the first bishop of Dublin in the 11th century, understood the power of the church and utilized it to establish and elevate themselves. Viking Age sculpture has long been noted at ecclesiastical sites, often displaying a hybrid of imagery or artistic styles. Therefore, a logical extension would be that if individuals from the new culture were entering the churchyard through the association of specific individuals or through sculpture, it could also manifest itself in burial. Burials and cemeteries are similarly known to be diversely constructed, from before the Viking Age to long afterwards. This even includes church-associated cemeteries, something noted in England as early as 1858 by John Lingard. Yet the distinct phenomena of Viking Age furnished graves being placed at or near church-associated cemeteries has not been focused on, with either a predominant focus on the furnished graves or early medieval churches. Before I continue, though, some definitions need to be established. While not necessarily solid concepts as they have some flexibility, they can be helpful when looking at the plethora of evidence. A Christian burial grave is typically an inhumation containing no grave goods, oriented east to west, placed behind in simple kist, wooden, or earth-cut graves in Christian cemeteries. However, exceptions to this rule exist throughout the early medieval world. A Scandinavian pagan burial grave is typically an inhumation or a cremation that utilized different practices and varied not just regionally, but locally, even in Scandinavia. Grave goods, such as small artifacts, i.e. tools, jewelry, weapons, vehicles, livestock, and even slaves could be included, and graves could be constructed from earth cuts to more elaborate structures using boats, ships, carts, or chambers. As a result, elements of a Scandinavian pagan burial could overlap with that of a Christian burial. With neither term quite fitting the graves in my research, which tread an unclear line, a third definition has therefore been created. A Viking Age furnished burial grave is typically an inhumation, though cremation remains a possibility, that contains grave goods from the Viking Age and therefore different from the typical Christian graves, but not necessarily Scandinavian or pagan, even partially. In the Irish Sea area and elsewhere, the lines between what was considered acceptable may have been more blurred, and as such, all objects that may even indicate clothed inhumations, as opposed to shrouded, are included in this investigation. Compounded with the long obfuscated process of Christianization, the line between Christian and pagan are blurred and hard to distinguish. Without time travel and a translator, knowing what the exact original intentions are unattainable. As a result, Viking Age furnished burial or grave is used. Meanwhile, ecclesiastical site will simply be denoted as a site, quote, belonging to or connected with the Christian religion, as defined in the Cambridge Dictionary. Therefore, I've used a more elastic term so as to accommodate the ambiguity which some of my possible sites have in the accompaniment of a church. Ecclesiastical landscape has been used similarly to encompass lands related to an ecclesiastical site, whereas church landscape denotes a church and its surrounding area. Christian landscape is anywhere associated with the Christian faith, so nearly everywhere in the Atlantic archipelago. Through my research, I hoped to meld the different forms of evidence regarding both the graves and the ecclesiastical sites. To contextualize Viking Age furnished graves in or near ecclesiastical sites within the textual record of burial practices, along with supportive archaeological evidence, to examine each ecclesiastical site and furnished grave to understand their context and appraise the relationship of the furnished grave to the other graves and features of the ecclesiastical site, to assess the characteristics of the furnished graves and the ecclesiastical sites to see if there are any trends more broadly across the Irish Sea and between the different regions, and to ascertain any divergences of the furnished graves and the ecclesiastical sites that led to a unique set of relations and negotiations between the clergy and the Scandinavian-influenced laity at the local level. Sources from multiple disciplines were utilized, including historical texts, religious texts, legal texts, burial archaeology, church archaeology, architecture, place names, sculpture, linguistics, and geography. The process therefore provided a balanced view with both micro and macro approaches to study the evidence, providing a more complete picture of this facet of lay and clerical relations. With the Viking diaspora leading to individuals immigrating to different geographic areas, the Irish Sea provided the opportunity to study an area that is both united and divided. The Irish Sea area comprises the modern-day areas of Southwest Scotland, Northwest England, Western Wales, the Isle of Man, and Eastern Ireland. While the sea has no specific boundaries, the North Channel provides an approximate northernmost limit, while the St. George's Channel provides the southernmost. For the purposes of my research, I defined the eastern and western perimeters as being approximately 30 kilometers or 18.6 miles inland, a day's journey, to provide a focus on areas closer to the coasts around the Irish Sea. As a result, several sites, such as Ormside in Cumbria and Caerwent and Bardsey Island in Wales were unable to be included, but I plan on integrating them with my pre-existing research in a future project. With a history of interaction before Viking Age settlement and pre-existing shared and divergent practices, the Irish Sea is a perfect microcosm with which to study the shared and varied experiences of Vikings and locals in the 9th and 10th centuries and the long-term process of conversion. Many newcomers would have already been exposed to Christianity, interacting with adherents through trade, raids, new settlement, missionaries, and conversion itself in Scandinavia by the 11th century, coinciding with settlement in the Irish Sea area. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic archipelago, the local population had largely been converted by the 9th century, and the landscape contained different ecclesiastical sites, with church-affiliated cemeteries increasingly supplanting that of lay familial cemeteries, although several of these continued to be used. Before I could begin studying the Viking Age furnished graves and the ecclesiastical sites, I needed to first establish what the perception of burial practices was at this time. 3 questions needed to be answered. Who was buried in a church-associated cemetery? How was one buried in a church-associated cemetery? Where was one buried in a church-associated cemetery? And did it even need to be church-associated? To investigate each of these, I scoured lay laws, ecclesiastical laws, letters, hagiographies, charters, wills, homilies, poems, and supporting archaeological evidence. References to burials in English and Irish texts can be traced to as early as the 7th century approximately. Due to the lack of contemporary records in the Isle of Man in Scotland, I relied on those from Ireland and England, particularly as information flowed throughout the Irish Sea area, and Galloway was often under Northumbrian control at that time. My focus related primarily to English and Irish texts dated from the 8th to 11th centuries, but earlier and later texts and archaeological finds were used for context when there was a lack of concurrent detail. As I said before, I cannot go into depth, but I hope to give you at least a partial view into my research and some of the rulings regarding burial practices. One of the ways that we see variation is the physical structure of the burial container. These would have altered depending upon wealth, status, available materials, pre-existing features, tradition, and personal or kin choice. 2 of the most elaborate appear in a description of the church in Kildare in Cogiosus' Life of St. Bridget, a 7th century hagiography. Quote, both namely Archbishop Conleth and our most flourishing Virgin Bridget are laid on the right and left of the ornate altar, and rest in tombs adorned with a refined profusion of gold, silver, gems, and precious stones, with gold and silver chandeliers hanging from above, and different images presenting a variety of carvings and colors. The elaborate container for the remains was most likely due to their status as key figures in the early Irish church, with other graves having a far more simpler construction. Wooden coffins are mentioned in the early Irish collection of law texts, the Shenachas Mór, Bede's 8th century ecclesiastical history of the English people, the Versilli Homily 9, a late 10th century English poetic manuscript, and different accounts of important religious and political figures. Stone is also referred to as material of a Chester tomb in the prologue to Adamann's Life of the Innocents. A poem, The Battle of the Sheaves, in the Middle Irish text, Dunora Finn, described a man burying his son and another man who had died in battle against Viking invaders. In the poem, the individual was described as being laid to rest with a pillow stone and the other in a wooden coffin in the earth. A pillow stone was also referred to in Adamann's Vita Columbae. In various accounts of the reburials of St. Cuthbert, he is described as being placed in a stone sarcophagus and later into a wooden coffin or chest at Lindisfarne, which is thought to be the one currently at Durham Cathedral on display. All of these features have been found in the archaeological record. Excavations have uncovered earthen graves, stone grave covers, stone-lined graves, wooden coffins or chests, lead coffins, sarcophagi, pillow stones, earmuff stones, charcoal graves, log coffins, and boxes for disarticulated remains. At the parish timber church of St. Lawrence Jewry in London, prosperity can be seen in individuals of all ages, being placed in pegged wooden boxes of planked oak in the early 11th century. While the cemetery smelled and was unsavory due to the nearby cattle pens and dumping ground, the construction of these coffins would have highlighted wealth, at least among the local community. Textually and archaeologically, an assortment of materials could be used to display the remains below and above the ground, depending more on factors such as wealth, social status, and availability of material. A similar case can be seen with the materials surrounding the corpse itself. Mil Rothartig, son of Sweeney, king of Eortre, in a 669 account of the Annals of Ulster, St. Columba, a 6th century Irish saint, in Adamant's Life of St. Columba, St. Ethelred and the 11th century fragmentary Annals of Ireland were all described as being interred in shrouds. In Ireland, other materials could have been used to wrap the body. The body could be wrapped or covered with a shroud, a sheet, an animal skin, or vegetative material. The vegetative materials sometimes included wrapping the body in rods or branches. The 9th to 12th century Irish poem, Cel Chorvana, states that branches, possibly birch, were utilized, paralleling a later marginal note that was made in the 12th century Book of Leinster and a grave at Holton Abbey, founded 1223 in Staffordshire, England. Numerous graves feature hazel, ash, or willow rods from the 11th to 14th, 15th centuries in England, Sweden, France, and Germany. And they are thought to be a blend of Christian burial practices with pre-Christian practices and to signify high status. Clothes were also a possibility, though, for people. In Ireland, burial in a monastic habit is known to have occurred. In one instance, the early medieval monastic and community church site of Church Island near Valentia, County Kerry, contained a double burial dated to 898 to 1028 that featured a woolen hem fragment, suggested to be a habit associated with one of the skeletal remains. It was located underneath the northwest corner of the stone oratory and in alignment with the earlier timber and sod church. While no Irish texts directly mention clothing, the Regularis Concordia, a 10th century English monastic reform text, may have been used, as it required a monk to be buried in clean clothing, including stockings, shoes, a shirt, cowl, and if he were a priest, a stole. Oxford Bodleian Laud Miscellaneous 42, an 11th century manuscript from Worcester, provides a similar perspective and contains various texts, including instructions for the preparation of the dead, lay or cleric, requiring that the corpse wear thumbless gloves, linen socks, a band across the mouth, and a haircloth with which to wrap the body. When it comes to Irish lay burials, though, archaeological indications of clothing tend to only appear earlier from the 4th to 7th centuries, differing from those in England, some of which date to the 9th to 11th centuries. That is not to say that all graves in Ireland were devoid of objects, but evidence of clothed burial in Ireland is less clear. Archaeologically, remnants of gold thread, linens, and pins have been uncovered in graves in England, ambiguously indicating clothing, as shrouds are still possible, or in the case of the pins, hair accessories. In the 10th century, the abbot and homilist, Elfric of Ensham, noted that those rising would not be wearing shrouds, but spiritual garments during the resurrection, implying that there were different ideas about how the body should be dressed for burial, in addition to how judgment was viewed. Elfric was not alone in England in his idea of how individuals should be dressed, with various accounts of important figures being buried in clothing, as well as shrouds and even grave goods. The aforementioned Versilli Homily 9 stated that the deceased was sewn into a garment, which could be clothing, although a shroud is also possible. Therefore, in addition to shrouds, clothing was an alternative for at least some individuals in the early medieval world, though they varied by site and geographic area. In both Britain and Ireland, evidence does exist for objects outside of those directly related to clothing or shrouds being included in some graves. Due to time, though, they cannot be elaborated on except for the fact that despite some objects being prohibited and laws rebuking more elaborate graves and grave goods, they still were present in some capacity during the early medieval period. Though investigating details such as these, I was able to understand the pre-existing context of beliefs, practices, and physical record in the Irish Sea area. My conclusion was that a variety of individuals could be placed at an ecclesiastical site due to the ambiguity and variations in the legislation. Similarly, no singular style of Christian grave existed at an ecclesiastical site throughout the Atlantic archipelago, with a variety of constructions and inclusions possible. Lastly, different locations held different meanings in the medieval world, but there was a range that could be considered acceptable in the eyes of the church and the laity. With Ireland and England, many similarities were present, but there were also many differences, highlighting geographical variation within the medieval Christian world. Within each of these, differences also existed among the church-associated cemeteries, suggesting that individual ecclesiastical sites were often left to make rulings based upon their unique set of circumstances, even if the laws dictated a specific course of action. Knowing, therefore, of the presence of graves with multifarious attributes, the possibility that Viking Age furnished graves could be considered acceptable became a distinct possibility. Taking into consideration my geographic parameters and the knowledge of the pre-existing practices, I analyzed a total of 75 furnished graves located at or near 27 ecclesiastical sites. While some of these were definitively ecclesiastical sites, some only remained possible sites and were denoted as such due to the lack of textual or archaeological evidence. These included Brigham, Rampside, Ballydoyle, Parnell Square, and Donnybrook. However, most of my sites had definitive evidence of the ecclesiastical sites being founded before the Viking Age, furnished graves, or around the same time, thereby suggesting the phenomena of displacement in the landscape was no accident. One clear example is St. Peter's Church and St. Patrick's Chapel in Heysham, Lancashire, at which two Viking Age furnished graves were uncovered. Heysham was in an accessible but defendable strategic location on a rock outcrop on a headland overlooking Morecambe Bay on three sides. Its geographic positioning is reflected in the place name, homestead, enclosure, or village in and among a wood in Old English, according to Eilert Ekwall in the Concise Oxford Dictionary of English Places. Heysham was also connected with different cultures in the local area, as well as further across Northumbria to York and around the Irish Sea. In addition to understanding the geography of Heysham, studying both the ecclesiastical site and the Viking Age furnished graves were crucial elements. Although the first reference to St. Patrick's Chapel was in 1094 and a grant from the honor of Lancaster to the Abbey of Saint Martin in Siez, Normandy, the town, along with the church, was listed as Hessam in the Domesday Book in 1086, with the ville being ruled by Earl Tostig, and then in subsequent land ownership deeds it was mentioned. To be named directly, the site would have had to have achieved prominence and had an affiliated ecclesiastical site by the 11th century. With the tradition of Patrick's landing here likely being a myth, the dedication quite possibly came from the spread of the cult of St. Patrick by either Irish missionary monks in the 7th to 9th centuries or Hiberno-Scandinavian settlers in the 9th to 10th centuries. The former is a stronger candidate, considering the date of the construction of the chapels and the earliest sculpture, thereby also contradicting the antiquarian claims to a foundation date of 1090. Often described as a twin church, St. Peter's Church and St. Patrick's Chapel were both chapels, roughly the same date, 8th century, size and construction, about 37.5 meters or 41.01 yards apart. Similar to Irish and Scottish chapels, St. St. Peter's Church was originally a Northumbrian single-celled building, small in size, rectangular in shape, and with a few small windows. St. Patrick's Chapel, which served as a chapel for worship, burial, and a shrine, combined features of Northumbrian, Irish, and Scottish designs, and paralleled Western British and Irish structures dating to the 7th to 9th centuries. It featured painted plaster, a feature in many medieval English structures and a common means of transmitting the Christian teachings to the illiterate as well as to the literate. At least 3 pigments were used, which would have been expensive and of an 8th or 9th century date based upon the use of the wall painting and the lettering. Reflecting other high-status ecclesiastical sites, sculpture from the 7th through 11th centuries was present, featuring local patterns as well as religious and possibly secular designs that paralleled other locations in the insular world, including Northern England, Ireland, and Scotland. Of particular note is the hogback, mixing Christian, Hiberno-Scandinavian, and secular elements. A type G hogback from the 10th century was designed with a concave base, a roof-like top, and beasts on both ends. A holy well was also present at the site, though details remain ambiguous as to its origin, and a building in ruins about a mile away may tenuously have had an affiliation. In addition to understanding, around the ecclesiastical site and inside of St. Patrick's Chapel, a cemetery spread with burial beginning as early as the foundation date of the buildings and continuing over several centuries. Constructions varied, including carved grave slabs, coffins, stone-lined graves, post holes for above-ground memorials, and high-status rock-cut graves. Aside from being unique in their construction and some of the earliest interments dating to the 2nd phase of St. Patrick's Chapel, the western and eastern rock-cut graves likely held disarticulated remains and were considered reliquaries, with one of them featuring a cross, no longer standing, and some having post holes. Placing saints within the cemetery itself is not unheard of in Ireland and could be representative of cross-cultural links already seen in the dedication. Other high-status graves were those in a central enclosed section with walls, those next to the walk to the chapel, those outside close to the chapel, and those within the chapel. The last group was dated primarily to the 2nd phase of the chapel, though a later grave dated to 1010 to 1085 suggests continued use. 2 skeletal remains in the Eastern Cemetery next to St. Patrick's Chapel were of a similar late 10th to mid-12th century date. Interestingly, modifications to the southeast chancel window of St. Peter's Church in 1864 uncovered skeletal remains and a chalice comprised of at least 2 fragments, possibly of lateen, in a medieval sandstone coffin featuring a recess for the head. It's unclear if this was an early rector responsible for the 11th to 12th century construction, as antiquarian sources claimed, but chalice and patens are known to have been placed with clergy members from about 1050 to 1150 as a symbol of medieval masculinity and power. Overall, the skeletal remains were primarily west to east with the head to the west, and were laid supine with crossed arms and extended legs. About 88 graves were excavated, with 78 to 84 individuals identified in the osteological analysis, comprising both sexes, all different ages, and the laity and the clergy. Despite the whole site not being excavated and some disturbed skeletal remains, the cemetery, the sculpture, and the buildings suggest a major ecclesiastical site with a consistent local population prior to and concurrent with Viking Age settlement. 2 Viking Age furnished burials were placed into this landscape. While grave digging in the late 8th to the early 19th century, skeletal remains were revealed along with a corroded iron spearhead underneath the aforementioned hogback, a possible grave cover. While the spear was a weapon, it may have had a spiritual connotation, symbolized status or power, or derived importance from its composition, history, or personhood, both aspects found in Scandinavian and earlier English culture. Located close to the north side of the church, the grave would have looked over Morecambe Bay. No other details regarding the burial were given. However, if it had been radically different, this would have likely been noted. During the 1977 to 1978 excavation of St. Patrick's Chapel, a burial with charcoal was unearthed with adult female sex skeletal remains and a 10th century crudely constructed Anglo-Scandinavian iron riveted antler hogback comb with a checkered pattern. The comb parallels those found elsewhere in Scotland and York, and the grave parallels other graves with combs and other graves with charcoal at church-associated cemeteries. Based upon the positioning of the skeletal remains, the deceased was placed in a shroud, lying west-east with the head toward the west, supine with crossed arms and extended legs, very similar to the other population. The shallow grave was not the first grave at the site, but it was during the first phase of the chapel, akin to others nearby. Being directly outside the south chapel door was significant, as it would have been visible to anyone walking along a path that directly connected to St. Peter's Church. Unstratified objects may indicate more furnished graves, but this cannot be confirmed. These two known furnished graves were similar to the others at the ecclesiastical site and reflect the various means by which people expressed their status and power. Part of a larger network of churches, Heysham was a well-established, well-connected, wealthy ecclesiastical complex that developed in the 8th century, was modified in the 10th and 11th centuries, and remained prominent long after the Viking Age. Once I performed a microanalysis on each ecclesiastical site, very similar to what I just described, and their associated Viking Age furnished graves, I then conducted a macro-analysis of all the ecclesiastical sites together, and then all of the Viking Age furnished graves. I did this by comparing different facets to assess any trends regionally or across the Irish Sea to see why these particular ecclesiastical sites were chosen and why these Viking Age furnished graves were included. I also wanted to ascertain any divergences of the furnished graves and the ecclesiastical sites that were the product of the ongoing negotiations occurring at each place. This was done through comparing elements related to the ecclesiastical sites, such as the type, dates of use, dedications, place names, construction of the cemeteries and graves, and geographical positioning. For the furnished graves, I looked at the aspects such as the skeletal remains, the composition of the graves, and the positioning in the landscape. Of the different aspects that were analyzed, two that were important were the materials of the grave containers, of the church-associated cemeteries, and of the Viking Age furnished graves, and whether the skeletal remains were shrouded and or clothed. With the knowledge that various constructions were possible in the textual and wider archaeological record, I wanted to analyze the different grave constructions at the 19 ecclesiastical sites where the construction of the graves was known. This was done primarily through excavation reports, although some antiquarian sources were used when they recorded the components of some of the graves. Numerous combinations of materials were utilized, for instance, those of a more elaborate construction, such as chests with keys and padlocks, or rock-cut graves, of a personal or practical construction, such as those with pillow stones or urma stones, or of a simple construction, being earthen, wooden, or kist/lintel/stone lined. Looking at the main materials, earth, wood, and stone, as you can see up on the PowerPoint, earth and stone appear to be the more prevalent than wood, but this may be due to preservation and the availability of materials. However, all of these materials were found throughout the Irish Sea area, with some graves clearly delineating high status burial and individual preferences. Shrouded burials are known to have occurred at 4 cemeteries: St. Michael's Church in Workington, Cumbria, the Church of St. Michael le Pole in Dublin, Ireland, one outside St. Bridget's Church on Bride Street in Dublin, and the Church of St. Peter near South Great George Street in Dublin. But this does not necessarily mean they were not present at more. Some graves at Workington appear to indicate clothed burial, but this cannot be confirmed as they comprise jewelry and dress fittings, possibly representing small grave goods included in the burial. With this knowledge, analyzing the Viking Age furnished graves revealed a similar variety of constructions, with earthen and stone graves being primarily used, and wooden graves existing as well, but in smaller known quantities. Some graves, such as one at St. Patrick's Isle on the Isle of Man, with a curved lid coffin, and another at Cronkenhow on the Isle of Man, with a decorated slab, were constructed with higher status materials. Most of the furnished graves were similar to their unfurnished counterparts, suggesting continuity among burial practices. However, a few exceptions did exist, with some constructions remaining unusual within their individual contexts. As can be seen by the chart, 3 of the earthen graves had a slightly different construction than the others. One over a burnt piece of wood, another over a hearth, and the third over a pre-existing ditch. They derived from the cluster of 4 Viking Age furnished graves on South Great George Street that were outside the ecclesiastical boundary of Dublin and the Church of St. Peter. They were the result of being placed in an area of previous settlement and industrial activity shortly before and after burial took place. At Balladule on the Isle of Man, a Viking Age furnished grave was constructed by a small boat being placed in a boat-shaped cairn, representing the most elaborate of the 75 Viking Age furnished grave constructions. Boats and graves were more common in Scandinavia and in non-ecclesial insular contexts at that time, but not exclusively, with clenched nails holding coffins together in ecclesiastical contexts, such as at St. Michael's Church in Workington, Cumbria, thereby representing similar boat-related burials. The construction could perhaps represent more of a cultural practice rather than one tied to religious belief transcending conversion. The construction may also be one of the reasons why its placement was in a liminal location. As regards shrouds and clothing, the evidence is ambiguous, particularly as dress fittings could have been used for either clothing or shrouds. However, one grave, the aforementioned burial at Hesham with the comb, appears to have been shrouded based upon the positioning of the remains. More shrouded burials could exist, but based upon the evidence, nothing can be said definitively. Clothed burials also existed, which can be seen by the positioning of the grave goods of one of the graves at Golden Lane in Dublin and associated with the Church of St. Michael le Pole. Most of the graves do not give a clear answer. This is particularly the case when multiple practices may have been used, such as with the grave featuring the pagan laity at St. Patrick's Isle, as she's on the Isle of Man, as she's commonly known, who may have been clothed, veiled, and/or shrouded. The construction of these graves both reflect the diversity present in burial practices across the Irish Sea area, but also how important individual negotiations between the clergy and the newly settled laity were at each ecclesiastical site. Through this snapshot and to the various parts of my research, I tried to show that not only did interactions and burial practices vary depending upon the geographic area, the population dynamics, and the individual church, but that in some cases, furnished graves were an acceptable variation of Christian burial practices in the Irish Sea area from the 9th to the 11th centuries. An active relationship between the clergy and the newly settled laity occurred, with each part recognizing how negotiations could enhance or maintain the respective power, wealth, and status. Beyond publishing this research as a monograph, I plan on expanding my research into several different directions, including looking further at ideas, practices, and other elements of the church disseminated around the Irish Sea area due to the Viking Age, and comparing the Viking Age furnished graves at or near ecclesiastical sites studied here to their counterparts in non-ecclesiastical contexts. Through future work, I hope to continue to use multidisciplinary resources to shed further light on the complex relationship of the church and Viking Age immigrants and descendants. The early medieval world was not a simplistic place with clear-cut rules, ideas, identities, and practices, but rather it was full of diverse, hybridized, intricate ideas, practices, identities, and societies that resulted from different people interacting with each other. Viking Age furnished burials at or near ecclesiastical sites embody this complex environment, becoming physical symbols of ongoing negotiations and the newly amalgamated landscape that was being created. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the Chester Archaeological Society for having me here.